Good evening, everyone. Welcome to After Wednesday. We're back, and we're starting a few minutes later tonight than usual. We had some unforeseen technical difficulties and also some life difficulties. Also, rushing around today was completely crazy. I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving. I know I did. I had a whole pecan pie, some bourbon, and cigarettes. Why? Because I'm an American. And that's what I do. So just live with it, all you politically correct people. That's right. I smoke, I drink, I eat pecan pie. It's what I'm here for. I'm pushing 40. I'll do what I want. Tonight on the show, I'm very pleased and very honored that he could take time out from his very busy schedule to be here. Is a filmmaker, writer, academic, scholar, professor, Joey Watson. How are you this evening, sir?
I'm great. You know, I think we should start off by congratulating you on your recent marriage to that lovely lady. Congratulations.
Well, thank you so much, man. Yeah, we had a great wedding. We were on. I was on break from the show for a couple weeks, and then yeah, it's been really nice. I appreciate that, man.
Well, I think they'll let you take a break for a little bit, you know, to get married. That's kind of a good excuse. So.
Yeah, not too bad. Till she starts pushing me into it again. She's just like, "Don't you have that thing to do?"
Yeah.
I was like, "Oh yeah."
Don't you have something to go do?
Yeah. Quit hanging around me so much. There's and I'll go ahead and just tell everyone listening tonight too, because I'm into transparency. I have known Joey for a very long time. 3 years now.
I think it's 20. I just tell people usually it's 20 plus years.
20 plus years.
Yeah.
That's fair. That's fair. And actually, you're like the bookend because I had Heath on a show very early on.
The Muppets. I love Heath. Yeah.
Yeah, man. He was on, and we talked all things Alan Moore. It was a great show. We talked League of Extraordinary Gentlemen on that show. So it wasn't too bad. So now I've had someone I've known 30 plus years, and now I'm having someone on that I've known for 20 plus years.
All right.
That's kind of nice. Let's get into it tonight. We're talking to Joey about filmmaking, about process and creation. We'll get around to talking about film and comics, but I want to talk about film specifically since I have a scholar, PhD, and expert with us this evening. My first question for you tonight is that you've spent your energies in your life towards creating and refining performance, because that's what film and stage is. And you began on working in the theater a lot. That's how also that we met. You taught me a lot about theater. I worked for you. I helped build sets and paint, and you taught me a lot about script, and that's the first time I sort of began to realize things about performance were in a lot of our conversations that we had. And you've been creating and refining performance on stage and film for so long now. What was your starting point for that? What sort of pulled you into that early on?
You know, are you talking about theater or just the arts and performance in general?
I think let's start with performance in general.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that, you know, like most people, it just starts at an early age when you're in that toddler phase, when you go to like 5, 6, 7 years old, and you don't seem to have a problem entertaining the guests that come over for, you know, dinner to, like, you know, hang out with your sister or your brother, and all of a sudden you've got an audience, you know. So I mean, I think for most people it probably occurs whenever you realize that you have an audience, and so you either embrace that moment and roll with it and start experimenting, or you know, sort of shy away and become more internalized and don't, you know, you don't like that live interaction or that live exchange with an audience. And so, you know, yeah, I mean, I was one of those kids, like so many, that just loved to play dress up and pretend and do, you know, all kinds of crazy things with assuming characters and, you know, rolling around the neighborhood and, you know, reenacting movies as best we could, you know, with our imaginations. Things like that, you know, I think were probably the breeding ground per se.
So you pretty early on though, you actually picked up the camera and made it happen for you. I mean, not a lot of people do that. It takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot of bravery, even when you're sort of fearless as a kid. What was the film that made you turn that corner to have that? Was there a film or was there a particular play or performance that gave you that just push over the edge to really pick it up and start doing it?
Well, my mom would probably tell you that it was when I saw A Christmas Carol for the first time. But I don't know if I would want to tie myself to Dickens that greatly. But she seems to remember me being really fascinated by sort of the magic and the pageantry of the stage. When I could actually, was old enough to sort of understand the story and what was going on. And I think that for me at least, it was kind of more of a cinematic draw. I mean, I was pulled into, science fiction and, all the classic sort of stories that have defined our mythology from Star Wars on down, and just, sort of fascinated with, how do people do that? I want to be one of those people, behind the curtain, kind of pulling the strings, which is really kind of saying, I wanted to be the storyteller. I wanted to be the one who was sort of guiding the audience in that way and performing in that particular aspect. So,
what you mentioned mythology and Star Wars sort of there in that in your response for people of our age group. It is an absolute cultural touchstone for us, and it seems to have inspired so many people. Do you remember the first time you watched Star Wars specifically?
Yeah, I was, I think, 5 years old, and
Mm-hmm.
it's actually one of the only memories that I have of my father. He took me to see that, and the only thing I remember, really vividly is, for all intents and purposes, that opening shot, of the Star Destroyer coming down, and you got the Dolby sound, and the Star Destroyer is like just this long ship, that just kind of is chasing this little tiny ship. Talk about perspective and a way to sort of awe, a 5-year-old. That did it. I was hooked at that point into that world. No question.
You mentioned there that about sound. How important is sound to you? Not only score, but the actual dimension of sound. How does that work into the philosophy of how you approach film?
Well, I think as I've gotten older, Jeff, I've gotten a stronger appreciation for all the components that go into sound in the movie making process. I mean, if you think about it, sound is like one of the five senses, of filmmaking, and it's such a crucial one because unless you're intending to make a silent film, the sound can just so quickly take someone in and out of a world that you've created. And so from the Foley effects on down to the to the musical score to incidentals to all those kinds of things have to work. And I think that the older that I've gotten and the more projects that I've been able to work on, the greater appreciation I have, not just for the artistry of it, but also for just kind of the magic of it. The way that you can kind of make a scene work or not based on what people hear. And I was listening to an interview recently with Carpenter, who I just love that guy. He's one of my mentors. But it's like he was talking about scoring his own films, and he was saying that he's obviously the cheapest, right, that he can find.
Yeah.
Do that. But obviously he likes doing it because he called it sniping, and I really liked that. He was able to go. He says he's able to go in and see a cut of a film before it has sound or music in it, and just kind of snipe it, and create moments with his either his musical composition or his sound designers. So I like that way of describing it. So I think you have to have good designers and talent. You can't do it all yourself, and so you really have to trust and rely on those folks. But the older I've gotten, the more nervous I get and more conscious I get about what we're capturing on set and what we can actually do in post. And it's probably one of the things that I knew the least about going into filmmaking, and I've learned the most about over time as I've grown.
My guest tonight is Joey Watson, and we're talking about all things film and creation and process. If you're listening tonight on Google Plus and you have a question for him, please type it into the question and answer box. I've enabled Q&A, and we'll try to get those in here momentarily. I want to go back here and talk for a moment about, as we're talking about sound and film and that added dimension of it, and you're talking about John Carpenter. Now, you've written a book about John Carpenter. That's correct?
Yeah, there's a book. There's a book in the works. It's about halfway done, yeah. So it's coming. You know, I had this little thing called a dissertation I had to finish first, but yeah, it's coming.
I wouldn't know what you mean.
Yeah. Something tells me you're lying now.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course I'm lying. I'm knee deep in it.
Yeah.
I'm knee deep in a 5th chapter, for Christ's sakes. But that's really boring. Anyway, I was talking to Matt Sheehan a couple weeks ago, who was on the show, and we were talking about cinematic music and how it inspires people. And Matt Sheehan and Malachi Ward, they're artists. They do a lot of drawing and painting, and I asked them about that, and they kept coming back to people like, we talked a little bit about John Williams and the importance of those scores and what they did to people's brains. How is that something that you think is still impactful the way that it was at that time? Is it like, who would you recommend right now as a composer that you would put out there and say, this is the stuff that makes people's dreams and imagination sort of fire on all cylinders?
That's a great question. I think that Hans Zimmer is doing some great work. Obviously in the last decade he's done some really fine work. I think for me, obviously, if you think about something like John Williams or Danny Elfman or even Carpenter with like Halloween or something, imagine those films without that score, and you take away some of the soul. I was talking to a friend of mine who's a really big fan of JFK, and we were talking about what would that opening sequence be without those trumpets and those drum beats, those staccato beats, and the way that it was edited just so precisely to match the rhythms of that opening, sequence. Where would those films be without that magic? It's once you start to break it down that way and you start to consider those senses, if you lose one, you're losing a piece of something, and. So I still think completely it's able to move people in that way. There's no question there. Yeah.
You use the word magic. Like, how do you contextualize that?
Oh, okay. Is this going to go in your lit review, or is this? I'm just teasing you. I'll contextualize it. I think that there is something that is. It is sensorial. It's a physical stimulus, but it's also an intellectual one. And I think that the magic happens when both of those get peaked at the same time. And I think that happens a lot in the arts. I think it can be in a movie, or it can be the way a line is read, or it could be a passage in a novel, or it could be a frame in a comic book. It's anything that sort of connects those two things simultaneously, because sometimes you can have them stimulated independently, but if you have two at the same time, if you're feeling something emotionally and physically, and you're thinking about something, then I think the magic is really sort of clicking and happening.
So you would connect then sort of this idea to, let's say, for example, when you're writing, you're not only thinking cinematically, there are some other elements at play or other tools. What might those tools be that you have found yourself going to time and time again to find that right rhythm?
Well, when I do, and I'm not saying this is unique to me. There's a lot of people who do this, so this is not anything new. But I create a soundtrack before I start writing a screenplay, or even a treatment, or even sort of putting some ideas on paper. And this goes for academic work too. There are things that I can put in, Mozart, on down that will stimulate, an academic writing session, but creative stuff in the fiction area, I try to go through and create a soundtrack of 15 to 20 items on a playlist, and then I'll just repeat those things, because those things kind of become my mood definers for a scene or a character. They kind of become a component of the process. If that's what you're trying to get me to sort of talk about.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, just making sure. Just making sure.
What let's talk. Let's stay on that about process then,
Okay.
because that's something I think people, and you can sort of elaborate on this a little bit more, because you do make films, you study film, you critique film, you write, make them, and teach others how to as well. People I find might not know or realize about creating a film that it's a very labor intensive and requires so many moving parts to work, and that doesn't always mean it will work correctly. That just to get it in motion. With your current project, you've provided me with some storyboards, and I was wondering if you could sort of walk us through that.
Yeah. Well, I don't always insist that we have storyboards. For this particular film that we're working on now, I have a student who is really smart visually, and she's actually serving as my cinematographer on the project. And these are storyboards that she created. And these were things that she sent me, before we shot these scenes just a couple of weeks ago, before Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
And I told her that we needed storyboards because, I was working, or I am working on this particular film project with a lot of sort of novice crew folk, and so I thought that we needed that as a roadmap, as we were going through the process, so that at least, did we vary from it? Sure, but is it there as a guidebook or sort of a home base to come back to? We could always come back and reference that storyboard to sort of get us back into the flow if we get too far off the tracks in terms of creating spontaneously on set, in the moment.
How often do you find yourself moving away from the storyboards? Like is it always just you when you're working on it, or do you actually, like you kind of were alluding to, do you go in and say, okay, let's do one take doing the storyboards directly, and then let's try something else?
Yeah, I think it varies, Jeff. I think that there's some times where I get wild hairs and decide to do something really weird just to see what would work and how it could be done. And sometimes those moments come from an idea that pops in my head spontaneously. It could come from something an actor does. I may catch something that a performer does and say, "Oh, I want you to do that again," and I'm going to set up a camera here. Or I might just say, let's do one more, and I want to set up right here. And sometimes I'm really transparent about what I'm doing, and then sometimes I'm not. But when we go in to shoot a certain scene, I tell everybody that's on the team, I say, look, we need to get our coverage first. Let's get our master shots. Let's get our our OTSs. Let's get our close-ups. Whatever we need to do. And then we can play after that. But let's go ahead and cover ourselves and get all of the coverage that we need before we start really playing. And sometimes we stick to that game plan, and sometimes I get a little excited and we get off that map. But it just really depends on the moment in terms of whether we veer or not from the game plan, so to speak.
So if you could, what I've got up on the screen now is the storyboard you shared with me. Can you just sort of walk us through this first page? Like, how does this come? So this comes directly from the script.
Yeah.
And obviously no dialogue, which is understandable. So this is just to block. Almost, it seems like to block and to know how you want people to move, sort of, and to be very specific in that sense.
Yeah. It really is to get an idea of how to sequence the story, because the way film gets cut together. You may not necessarily have to see someone walking out the door. You can just assume that they're going to walk out the door, and so you have to kind of get an idea of where the movement's going to be and where actors are going to turn and where you kind of want the camera for key moments. Sydney here, when she did this storyboard, and these are scenes from our lead actress in the hospital, so that's why she's is kind of laying in the bed, and there's a character there with what looks like a notebook. That's the doctor, and he's talking to her husband, and so these are kind of the just a visual sense of how we're gonna create a flow with the story through just the images, and then the lines we try and catch as they as they pop up. So for example, a couple of these angles here, these are just at the top of your screen here right now, these are just over the shoulder shots, right? And then we pull out for wider coverage here. So depending on how many cameras we have, we've been primarily working with 3 cameras. On the next shoot in February, we're going to go back to 5, which is gives us a lot of creative freedom because we can do multiple setups. It speeds up time, but we're able to sort of set up cameras ideally with these angles in mind, and we can work blocking into it, and sometimes it changes, sometimes it doesn't. We stuck pretty close to these storyboards that you're seeing here. We didn't deviate very much from these particular ideas. But yeah, it's primarily for a sense of blocking as well, but it's also just to get us going in terms of how we're going to visually piece the thing together.
How is talk about, if you could for a moment, how important the art of storyboarding is in modern movies. I know from a little bit that people like the Coen brothers obsessively storyboard their films, that there are no chances that they take.
Right.
When they do that, what's the philosophy for a lot of people with storyboards? Is this how people sell movies? I mean,
well, sure. I mean, I think that anything that includes storyboarding, from advertising and commercial pitches to major feature films, I think you put it there to give somebody a visual sense of how something is going to flow, feel, or behave. And I think that I read things like Hitchcock storyboarded, he never wasted an ounce of film, blah blah blah. I don't know if that's true, but it's interesting to think about it. Certainly he storyboarded, we have evidence of that. But the Coen brothers, obsess. I think anytime that you have a situation where you have a 10, 20, $30 million budget, you better be precise about what you want. There's a lot of money at stake there, right? When you're playing on a more level playing field where there isn't so much money involved, when you're under 100,000 or under 50 or under 25 or under 10, you're given a little bit more creative freedom, so you have more spontaneous moments like that. I think different directors just approach it in various stylistic ways. Altman used to say that he liked getting on set and blocking everything almost like a theatrical rehearsal, and he never storyboarded. He would get on set and he would look at how the actors would behave and rehearse, and then he would set up his cameras based on what they did. And other directors would approach it the exact opposite way. They would have camera first, actor second. So I think it's just a stylistic thing, and storyboarding can either be an aid or it can be a hindrance to those things. I got to the point where I didn't storyboard a whole lot for projects, except if there was a really complicated sequence, where there was a lot of action or there was a lot of movement or a lot of things going on, and then I would need to sort of make sure that everything was sequenced in a way. But I love looking at storyboards. I love imagining with the storyboard artist or creator. And it's one of the joys of comic books too, because you and I have talked about this before, and it's one of the great draws of comics for me. Was in essence like reading a storyboard, a really elaborate, storyboard. They were sequenced to me. That's the way I conceive of comics in some ways, and I don't mean that to be derogatory to anybody. I mean, to me, it's a really high compliment, because Their storyboards look a hell of a lot better than mine here. But you know, you get the idea. You know, I mean, it's a way of framing in pieces and sections a tale. You know, a story. And you know, comics are so cool because, you know, you can turn the page and the frame is like, you know, the entire page, or it's half the page, or it's the top third corner, or it's, you know, I mean, it's layered in that way. So it's like, you know, this really enhanced, augmented storyboard that tells you this cool story. So it can certainly give you a great, you know, idea. Some people will probably even say that, you know, movies are just, I don't know, actualized comics, right? I mean,
Yeah. Well, let me ask you about that then while we're on it. What there's you know, this is normally, of course, a show about the comics medium. What is your opinion then on the current boom of the superhero genre in film? What do you attribute to its unbelievable, it seems unstoppable almost, success globally?
um, Disney? No, you know, I don't know. I don't. I mean, it's a great question. I think it's probably the answers are probably really complex. I mean, you know, these superhero stories, and I myself am experiencing a little bit of what I would call superhero fatigue. You know, I get a little overwhelmed by the Easter eggs and the universe and sort of the intertextuality of all the Marvel stuff, and you know, because I just wasn't, as I was a DC kid, I wasn't really, you know, Marvel was something that, you know, came later for me. So the recent boom, which I would really attribute to Marvel, with all due respect to Christopher Nolan, you know, Marvel, they've done it, you know, they've done it right. You know, they pieced everything together. It's, you know, it's connected but yet separate, and so I think people feel a part of that universe, you know. And I think also too, Jeff, we probably cannot discount the rise and growth of, you know, digital technologies and being able to create these worlds, to actualize them, to, you know, to create such believable, you know, worlds. Whereas, you know, 20 years ago, you couldn't make these kinds of movies because the effects were you know, were limited.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, now we've got the tools to be able to do it. You know, these stories have been with us, you know, since time immemorial, it seems. And so, you know, we just, of course, you know, we're hungry for it. It's an addiction, you know.
Is that it's interesting you mentioned that, because I want to sort of segue into talking about adaptation,
Mm-hmm.
because that's what these films really are.
Sure.
Some of them are direct adaptations, some of them are loosely based adaptations of existing material, and some people get kind of huffy about it. I personally don't, because I'm a student of certain theories of adaptation. Could you explain a little bit about what the theories of adaptation sort of are, and how it shapes so much of the current pop culture landscape and film and other media?
Well, you know, my exposure and understanding of adaptation comes from, you know, Robert Stam and Linda Hutchin and some of these folks in comparative literature, and you know, who've really done some fantastic work. You know, Stam's essay Beyond Fidelity, and you know, people like James Nairmore, who was writing about rhetoric, and Deborah Cartmel, and you know, all these people that I had to read in graduate school, you know, really sort of opened the, you know, doorway to understanding adaptation better, because I think in some ways people take kind of a purist stance. You know, it's like, you know, something is holy and you can't, you know, any kind of remake or adaptation is sacrilege. And I think that some of these, you know, academics or these scholars that I was talking about, particularly Hutchin, you know, adaptation is, you know, it's kind of like redecorating in a way. You know, it goes on in that media landscape. It's, you know, interior design. It shows that we have a, you know, a revitalized countless methodology for redoing homes, and I think we approach texts the same way. You know, what can we change? You know, what's the what, who, why, how, where, when, you know, of those media things, with all due homage to Hutchin there. I'm going directly off her now, but you know, these things, you know, this is part of the pleasure, and it's also part of the pain. Is understanding where those things have come from. I think at its core, Jeff, it's we enjoy adaptation because it's repetition with variation. It's a comfort of ritual. And there's a small sort of bit of surprise, that we're looking for as well in that ritual, in that adaptation, and the purists don't enjoy that. They don't like the repetition from adaptation. They want to keep it, the way it was when they first experienced it. But certainly, I think that it's bigger than that. I think it is. If you look at it from a cultural perspective, I think it comes down to just simple pleasure from the repetition of a ritualistic story or narrative structure.
You work with young people quite a bit, and I'm curious because they are basically trying to tell stories now themselves visually through learning more about film, wanting to be filmmakers and actors and writers and performers. I'm curious, do you find that they have, at least you can only speak to the young people that you work with closely, do they have an appreciation for the history of stories, or do you have to steer them that way?
Well, I think that probably varies per student. Some of them come in with a very rich understanding of narrative. Others with a very sort of elementary understanding of it, and they just. So I think a lot of it, Jeff, in a pedagogical sense, has to do with exposure. Some students are exposed to different kinds of storytelling and narrative. Others, have been sort of, log jammed into a genre or a really repetitious way of telling something that we would consider, I guess, generic, and so you have to sort of challenge them to think outside the box. So to people like that, students like that, I just throw them like Fellini, and then I'm like, yeah, tell me about narrative now, it's like a cruel trick, right? But it's like, no,
Yeah.
you need to experience this, you need to be exposed to these things, and so I think it varies per student, but a lot of it is just about how much hunger or veracity they have to have either experienced different kinds of storytelling or to be stuck in a routine.
Can you really teach someone to tell a story?
Yeah, I think you could teach them the basic structure. I mean, I think you can definitely tell them it's got to have a beginning, middle, and end, and the act structure, and there's got to be transitions, and Aristotle had some things right. I mean, I think there's let's credit him. I mean, he had some things right. What I think you can't teach is you can't really, I don't know, I have a difficulty sometimes qualifying what's a good story, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Because it's just so subjective, so I can identify things as a story, but but the good and bad sort of critique is something that they have to figure out on their own.
Well, let's talk about criticism then for a moment, where we live in a culture now where it seems like critics are hatched daily. How do you then try to get them to think about critiquing at a certain level? What do you find is a good level? What would you define as a good level of criticism?
That's a great question. I think really the first step, and really the one that you keep coming back to with critical sensibilities, and I mean, I guess what we're really talking about here is a form of kind of critical thinking. But I think that if you can teach them to decontextualize, I mean, that's sort of the basic, right? But if they can get, you can teach them the sort of the pathways that stem from deconstructing, right? Like, okay, so if I take something out of its context and I look at it, what are the myriad of ways that I can read something like this if I decontextualize it, Then if they can get onto that skill, I think that you've got them there, and then it's just about prodding them in certain theoretical directions that they enjoy, and then they start to understand how they see the world through stories because they've applied a critical lens to it, and they understand, human behavior and human interaction through that lens. But I think that going back to that sense of having them look at something not as, you know, reality or what it is in front of them, but having them decontextual, take it out of the familiar and start looking at it from different perspectives. If you can get them on that train, then you've pretty much got your hooks in, I think, at that point.
How hard is it for you to change your critical perspectives as you get older and you incur more experiences to put into that critical toolbox?
Um, I am still surprised at times, and I think that's what keeps me going, in terms of not just what I see from student work, but also from you know contemporary fiction in multiple mediums. If I'm surprised by something, then there's some sort of a rupture that happens, right? There's like a disconnect that occurs, and your eyebrows pop up, and you start, oh, that's interesting. I mean, you just sort of deviate for a second, and I think that as long as I'm still able to be surprised, then I think I'm doing okay because I haven't really landed in a camp where I'm stuck in some sort of constant critical lens where I have to see something in this way, because that's the way to see it. I mean, I think graduate school wants you to be that way, and they want to mold you that way. But I fought that tooth and nail until the very end. I said, I just don't think that there is any such thing as a truth with a capital T. There's just a lot of little T's, and you just have to really be open to the surprise.
But we seem to live in a media culture of capital T truth, and I
Yeah.
don't know what's the what's the genealogy of that? I mean, in your opinion, let's just stick to media in general. These capital T truths that in media that sort of have filtered down to the recent generation of young people. I don't know. Do we call them net? Do we call them millennial? I get confused sometimes. But what's sort of your take on that?
Well, so our media culture today, I think, obviously is quite different, from, what our parents were raised with, and, them before then. Obviously, in some key ways, it's very different. In other ways, it's quite the same, right? I think the big T part of your question comes from simply the sort of corporate control and dominance of the media, which obviously still exists today. I mean, you cannot, deny that there is a corporate, complex that still runs the way that we receive messages and information. But I think that there's been the one good thing that social media has done, I think, is that it has at least, kind of from the bottom up in some ways deflected that notion of capital T, little t, and I'm going off Henry Jenkins, on down this idea of convergence culture and breaking down the top bottom model. I mean, his latest thing was spreadable media. It's all about how it's shared and spread, and what gets shared and what gets spread. But I think that has disempowered some of the big T, but not all of it. I mean, it's still very much there, and I think there's what you're seeing now in some ways is a little bit of a bite back from social media exhaustion, say Twitter or some one of the other applications where everybody's a critic, everybody's a journalist, everybody's got an opinion, and I think it's sometimes as students said to me the other day, gosh, it probably was easier when there were just 3 networks, and that was a surprise, right?
Yeah.
Because it's to me that's an example of someone who's trying to think outside the box and decontextualize something that he's currently living in and apply it to something that he has no connection to. But and I just had to honestly say, well, yeah, sure, I'm sure it was simpler, and and a little bit easier in some ways. But I don't know if simpler is always better, and I don't know if simpler is always, meaning that we're getting completely informed in the way that we should be, informed. So I said in some ways it was probably simpler to control that way.
Yeah.
And then I gave him Chomsky's media control, so I'm sure he's going to be ruined for life now.
Oh, sweet Jesus.
Well, you got to get these kids, you got to get them into something,
Yeah.
But yeah, so that, where we're at in terms of that, I wonder, with in a little bit of awe, like for the next, 5 years or so, where we're going to be, in terms of that.
My guest tonight is Joey Watson, and we're talking about film, process, culture, and media. If you have questions for him and you're watching us tonight on Google+, please go ahead and type in your question, and it will pop up here, and I'll be happy to ask him your question. I want to go back, since we're talking about this, I want to go back and talk about that idea of magic. I, of course, quizzed you on your definition of magic as it relates to creating and sort of in film. To me, what magic is with film and how I would define it these days is that I'm very fortunate. I live in a place that has a mid-sized film festival every year. I live in Birmingham, Alabama, and we have the Sidewalk Film Festival, and I've been going the last number of years to it, and to me, it has rekindled the magic of film through the context of watching film with people in a public space.
Sure.
And sharing that, and then sharing the after moments of walking out in the hubbub of excitement and disappointment and anger in some cases, depending on the films. But just the murmur, I'll steal from Whitman the blab of the pave, right? It's the sound of the sounds. In his case, he was talking about the wagon wheel that hits the stone. But to me, it's the sound of the people engaged with each other immediately in a larger space, in a real space, not in a virtual space. And to me, that's true magic. How do you think that will ever diminish?
No, I get asked this question in some ways when I get asked questions like, is the movie theater going to die, or and that you're absolutely right, Jeff. I mean, we understand that there is a communal experience that occurs when you're having a shared collective, viewing like that, and really, it's really kind of unprecedented. Movie theaters aren't going to go away. That kind of experience isn't going to. If at bare minimum, teenagers still need a place to go make out, in a theater somewhere. So they're going to still hang open just because of that. But all kidding aside, I think what you're running into is, in some ways, it's kind of like apparatus fascination, right? I mean, there's this sense of like, well, I've got a 77-inch, flat screen wall TV with, 800 gigabytes of, Dolby sound. I'm making it up, but you get the point, right? There's like this idea of, I've got the optimal viewing experience, and I don't think that even with the rise of improvements in those apparatuses, I think that it's going to still be a thing that people enjoy doing. How many times have people declared the live theater dead? How many times have people declared, cinema dead? I mean, what at Cannes this last year, everybody from Quentin Tarantino to George Clooney on down was like, oh, cinema's dead, and I'm like, well, guys, the people are still going. I mean, people are still going, and I think that it's a testament to what you just described, Jeff. It's that whether they know it or not, consciously or not, it is that sort of, I need to see this and share this with other people, because that's something that's really special and magical.
I have a question here from Nicole Trevino, who asks, what is the most interesting experience you ever had working with students on a film set?
Well, gosh, that's a great question, because there's a lot of different things that I could share here. I think I don't know if it's the most interesting, but I'll tell you it was the most illuminating experience, and that was when I was working with some students at LSU on a project, and I had someone who was kind of a he's kind of someone who wanted to be a director, but he wasn't really quite there yet, and he kind of fought me all the way on some things on set one day, and one of the things that's tough about doing films in this kind of environment, Jeff, with students, is the fact that you're really teaching as you're directing. I mean, it's really you're doing two things at once. You're telling a story as a director of a film, but you're also teaching these students how to do this as a process. So I just sat down. I just said, I'm going to go take 10. You take over.
Hmm.
And, I left and walked outside, and it was about 15 minutes later. I see the lead actress coming out to take a smoke break, and pretty soon the AD comes up to me and says, are you coming back in? Because we kind of need, But so that was probably the most illuminating, because sometimes in those kinds of experiences, you got to step away in a situation like that and teach by not doing, just kind of stepping out and letting them fall flat on their face, and then coming in without any kind of haughtiness and just kind of trying to help them learn from where they fell down.
We have another question. What was the most frustrating thing that happened on set of Which Way There?
Oh, that's a current student. And I know what they're asking about there. Um, okay, so I will tell this story. I've got a student who is a really sweet guy, and he was working boom, and we're standing back, behind the monitors, and we're on the second or third take, and this student was kind of rattling the boom mic a little bit, and I said, hey, stop doing that. We're picking that up. And then he bumped into something, in the next take, and we weren't rolling at that point, but I could tell, if he doesn't get his head on straight, something's going to happen, right? And then, sure enough, the next take, I'm looking at this shot. It was a pretty good take too from the actors, and there's a boom mic just sitting at the top of the shot, and so I just said, get the boom out of my shot, I just, that was probably the most frustrated that I got with something that a student did. But then there was another moment that's probably a better story. That was we were shooting a scene in the hospital. We had a pretty large hospital room to work with, but there were 4 actors in this particular scene. Lots of movement, lots of dialogue, people coming and going. I was trying to set up 3 cameras. We're running, late on time. We're trying to get this done and wrapped so we can move on and get out of there. And I just kind of threw my hands up in the air at one point and said, I don't know how to do this. Let's take 5 so I can figure it out, or somebody can tell me what to do. Again, it's that stepping away because it was just too complicated of a setup, and we had to rethink that. And sometimes it's important to just step away and consult and then come back at it.
How does film still feed your soul? How does it still inspire you every day? It seems, because every day you get up and every day you inspire young people to make film. How does film sort of inspire you still every day?
Man, it's just, if I'm not creating, I'm dead. I mean, I got to be working on something. And this, making movies is just, it is a creative utopia in a lot of ways. It's a hell of a lot of work, but it's just so much damn fun, and you don't want to tell anybody that it's that much fun because it's a lot of work. And so people go, well, how can it be that much fun if it's that much work? But it is, and I think part of that process that makes it so fun and what keeps driving me to not only be inspired but to try and inspire, it's what I hope I do, is that communal experience that you get from putting a show together, from putting a film together. It's in theater, it's in, it's all the cliches in sports, it's all, but it's that communal experience of making it together that really drives it, because you become a family, and you have, you're in jokes and you're fun and you're teasing, and so you get your work done, but but it's It's so much fun to get up and create every day.
If you meet a young person who isn't a student of yours, and talks to you about, you strike up a conversation about film, and they mention that they would love to make films, what would your advice to them be?
Um, okay, so in this scenario, they want to make films, but they don't know how to get started.
Right.
I would tell them to come get a camera from me. I mean, seriously, I would just say, you want to do this, come get a camera from me. And if they kind of shy away, I would say, you got a phone?
Mm-hmm.
You know, what you got? And that, just you got to get started. I mean, if it's something you want to do, you got to do it, and you have to keep doing it. And you're gonna make a lot of shit. You're gonna make a lot of bad stuff, but that's part of the process. Your failures are the the greatest things, because that's where you really pick yourself up and learn. From the experience. But I'm much more of a process guy as opposed to a product guy. But I think that the joy is found in that process. And so I would tell them, just pick up a damn camera. Whether it's from me or whether it's from somebody else, get out and do something. And that stems from my undergraduate experience, where I had a film teacher. One of my first film teachers came in on the first day of class and looked around the room and said, "Oh, so you all want to be filmmakers, huh?" And I kind of mumbled a little bit, and he says, "Well, if it seems to me you'd be out making films and not sitting in my class." And
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of that's a little haughty, arrogant, whatever, but at the same time, he was making a point, and I think that has stuck with me, ever since. So if I see interest or excitement or energies towards wanting to do this, it's my job, in my opinion, to try to empower them with resources or anything that I can give them to get them on their way, to doing it, because it's not going to do itself. You just got to pick up a camera and go.
That reminds me of one of my favorite quotes that Scorsese said about Kubrick once, where he said, he says, he only gave us this handful of films, but that was the process. Like, we all wish that he'd made more films, but that wasn't the process. It was his process.
Yeah.
And you have to love what he gave us, because he gave us 110% in that process.
Right.
All the time. And that's why those films still, even today, a film like, I'm amazed when I talk to someone, and I'm an unabashed Kubrick fan. Like, I'll throw a Kubrick film up there against anything usually, and just say I marvel when someone watches Lolita, or when they watch Barry Lyndon, which is a favorite of mine. I mean, the absolute arrogance of Barry Lyndon just getting made is absolutely astounding.
Yeah.
It's basically saying, and for those of you who have never seen Barry Lyndon, he basically he said, I want to make a film, and I want to shoot it in natural light, a lot of it. Nobody has my camera, well, fuck them. I'm going to make the camera. I'm going to make it happen. And he did. And I think that that's a testament to this idea of that, nobody was going to screw with his process. Like, he was going to make it happen. And I think that that's sort of a beautiful thing you're saying at the core of your idea, too, about that. It is about, I think for a lot of people who do create, I think it really is about process a lot of times.
Yeah, and I think, I would agree, and I think there has to be, if you're going to do this consistently, you've got to be a little bit of a rebel. I mean, you've got to be, confident, not over arrogant or anything like that, to where you won't listen to, good advice from your team, but you've got to be. You've got to be confident in what you're doing, and you've got to be a little rebellious, because there's going to be so many people that are going to tell you that it's a waste of your time, that you shouldn't do it. And you just have to stay focused and a little rebellious. So, it got to the point for me where if somebody would tell me I couldn't do something, then look out, because I'm already looking at ways to do it. I mean, I'm just going to find a way to make it work.
And I think that that's a really good positive note to end on this evening. Can you hang out for a minute, man, while I wrap things up?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in this week. And thanks, of course, to my wonderful guest, Joey Watson. Feel free to share this show via Google+, Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, whatever your social media poison is. If you want to contact us on Twitter, sort of interact with us a bit more directly about the show or about things that you're hearing, or maybe you have questions you're curious about, you can contact me. I'm at JLDPROD2002. Joey Watson can be found at Jedi1172, you know where his allegiances lie. What's your other one? You have a secondary one that you use with your students.
That's primarily the one that I use for my students in my academic stuff, is GSW _ Dr.
Okay. Well, man, thank you so much. This show has been a long time coming. I'm so glad that you could take some time out tonight to talk to me and to talk to everyone about what you do. And you're the most knowledgeable man I know about film, and I'm happy to have call you a friend and a brother for 20+ years now, and you never cease to stop teaching me about things.
Oh, thanks, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, everybody, thank you again so much. Until next time, be safe.